Okay, this panel is about challenges and opportunities for mining on the energy grid. We are joined by Bob Whitmire, who is going to be our moderator for the session, Marshall Long, Pierre Rochard, and Prasad Enjeti. Got some talent up here, so let's Bob take over. This is a 30-minute panel, so I'll be hearing you guys here in a second.
Hi, like you said, my name is Bob Whitmire. I'm chair at ERCOT, a large flexible load task force. Just real quickly, ERCOT formed a large flexible load task force because if we called it a crypto task force, the feds got very interested. So being good Texans that we are, of course, we found a way around getting the feds involved, and that was a large flexible load task force. We're going to talk today a little bit about the challenges to the grid. The Bitcoin miners, to some degree are coming in at an unfortunate time in the electric grid. The electric grid is going through a major transition of which Bitcoin miners will be part. But they are also going to get blamed for a lot of things that are coming on that are not their fault. When I started my career, the electric grid looked very much like World War II equipment, and it all worked really, really well. And I kind of think it is a World War II bomber plane. And we are trying to convert that bomber plane now into a stealth fighter. And the issue is we never get to land that plane while we make that conversion in the air. And frankly, we're not entirely sure how to make that conversion. We recognize that Bitcoin can help us with that, but it's not the only problem we have. Inverter-based resources pose a new set of challenges that we've never seen before, and they're coming at us much faster than we ever anticipated. So those are kind of the things we will be talking about today. To my immediate left is Prasad Enjeti, Marshall, and Pierre. So one of the things that ERCOT is interested in is requiring loads to have voltage ride-through requirements. This is a very new concept for a load. It's existed for generations for quite a while. But panel, what is your thoughts on having loads have to have a voltage ride-through requirement?
I think we'll let Prasad start with explaining what voltage ride-through is.
I think that's great.
Okay, thank you. So voltage ride-through is not anything new concept. It's been there ever since electricity and the short-term power interruption. When I was doing PhD, it was the Electric Power Research Institute came back and said, hey, can you do this study on short-term power interruption, for adjustable speed drive pumps and chemical industries, a lot of loss of revenue. Can we get some new technology in place to ride through? And then we started to work with Toshiba and a few other companies. And then, of course, now that's behind. And that's like a software. The solution is already in every motor drive already. So Bitcoin mining, one thing which is very different is a large flexible load, right? So you don't need UPSs or you don't need any of those things. So voltage ride-through we have to do with a lot of testing. So we have done quite a bit of testing in our lab, and we have good data to share. Right now, one line conclusion is that the mining machines cannot ride through more than half a cycle, which is 9 milliseconds. So that's a one line conclusion for now. I think it'll improve.
And is it fair to say, though, that for a Dell server at a traditional data center, that it's the same kind of voltage ride-through, except in that context, as you mentioned, they might have an uninterruptible power supply that sits between the facility and the grid that allows them to be more resilient, but that it also, for their use case, it makes sense because they need to be on so that websites work. Whereas for Bitcoin miners, we're highly interruptible, so that it's an extraneous cost from our perspective. But then the challenge is if we have a large facility that has 100 megawatts that gets interrupted very suddenly due to a voltage sag, that dropping a 100 megawatt load would have effects on broader grid reliability. Is that fair?
Yes, yeah, that is the big issue. I mean, many of these miners, as you know, are hundreds of megawatts. To put that in perspective, for those of you in the Dallas area, the city of Garland is about a 500 megawatt load, and that is the city of Garland, every resident, every building, every industrial process in the city of Garland footprint. That's about 500 megawatts of load. Same exact thing in Lubbock. They're about 500 megawatts of load as well. So you can see that these Bitcoin miners are a significant, point sink on the electric grid, and that's really what has caused ERCOT so much concern. You can imagine that if we have, the city of Garland were to drop offline, that has big implications for the rest of the electric grid.
Yeah, the good news is most of the hardware is not necessarily bespoke, but easily changed in time. So, and it's also granular. So the fact that right now we can only handle 1 or 2 cycles, it's not far-fetched to say that if this becomes a priority, the hardware can be retrofitted relatively easily and without a lot of implementation pain. So I think it should be fun in the near term.
That is really good news to hear, because that's not what ERCOT is thinking is about to happen to them. And yeah,
I think, though, that the issue has to be balanced with what is the root cause, which is that power generation has been getting further and further away from loads due to this energy transition towards wind and solar. And so when you have more and more transmission, that's when you introduce more noise into the power quality that gets delivered to the loads, and create more difficulties in terms of voltage ride-through. So I think that from a policy perspective of where are the costs going to be allocated, I think that has to be kept in mind, is that the Bitcoin miners are not the ones causing the voltage, sags on the grid. It really is about kind of this energy transition and how the externalities are going to be absorbed by the right parties, so that we're factoring in, hey, look, wind is great, solar is great as well. They do have costs associated with them, and in particular on the transmission side. And so transmission we can't cut corners on transmission and then expect loads to pick up and be more resilient. But I think, though, that there has to be a meeting of the minds, right? We have to find ways to work together so that we're all working in the direction of grid reliability.
And no, you're absolutely right. And thank you for pointing out that the voltage problem is not caused by the crypto miners, right? It is part of that energy transition we're going through, and that's why I said it's kind of unfortunate, the timing, because Bitcoin, of course, is politically a hot potato, and it's fun to blame the new guy always, as opposed to, oh crap, we let too much inverter-based resources on the grid all at once. I mean, it's what everybody wants, right? We all want zero carbon emissions stuff, but if we go too fast, your lights are not going to be on 24/7 for 20 years at a time. We're going to have issues there. Let's shift briefly. One of the other issues ERCOT has is the ramp rate of these loads. The way pricing works in ERCOT effectively is we'll go from a $50 price to a $1,000 price in a 5-minute time frame. And when that happens, all the, whole bunch of Bitcoin miners want to come offline. Right now, there is approximately 38 gigawatts of Bitcoin miners in the ERCOT electric queue. For all those raising your eyebrows, yeah, it's not real. But we don't know what is real and what is not real. And there's not a good filter today to figure that out. There's processes going on at ERCOT, additional fees and things that they're looking at to try to filter out that queue. But everything's clogged up by that 38 gigawatts. But because of that, ramp rate becomes a huge issue. The thoughts on, and the problem with ramp rate is, You are consuming power when prices are $1,000 up to $5,000. If there's a slow ramp rate, you're getting a big bill for that. But ERCOT doesn't have the resources to back down that far if all the load drops off. Thoughts on ramp rates? Here?
Well, I think that when we look at the price moving from $50 to $1,000, and I would argue that happens instantaneously in the sense that you have a 5-minute interval of $50, and then suddenly you have a 5-minute interval at $1,000. And the context in which that's happening is that there are rapid changes happening on either the generation side or on the load side. So, for example, just as a kind of a case study, if we look at the solar ramp down in the evening, where you have 10 gigawatts of solar generation coming offline, and that might cause the electricity price to suddenly spike up. And if you have Bitcoin miners turning off, they are essentially offsetting the generation, right? So you have less generation and less load simultaneously. And so if those ramps are aligned, then we have no net effect on frequency or on the system as a whole. I think the challenge is kind of reconciling between the financial level of what the electricity price is and the physical level of what's going on the grid, and having those ramps be aligned so that we don't create a mismatch that creates demand for additional ancillary services.
Yeah, to that point, ERCOT's done a good job of incentivizing with ancillaries, but that's more so of a Band-Aid. You know, the grid was built for peak demand, not necessarily for a base load. And so having a synchronous demand and generation, I think, is kind of the point of being a nice, large, flexible load. So the more that those signals can be cross-pollinated through CLR or whatever other ancillary services that you may or may not need, I think is really the reality. As demand drops or as supply drops, those need to be in queue, and when they're not, that's why you have pricing events. And because miners are so sensitive to it, it actually works well for without regulatory pressure. It's very aligned from an incentive standpoint.
So at Texas A&M, we have a smart grid center in which we have built a synthetic Texas grid because we don't get the real data shared. So we made up our own grid called a synthetic with the best guess. So having a synthetic grid and then having to do a lot of simulation studies there with the existing Bitcoin miners being rapidly changing their loads, we found out that the price actually equals out. And also it'll also improve reliability. You can throw in more variable generation like solar and wind. And when you have a large flexible load which can rapidly ramp up and down, it actually helps the grid. That's in one of our publications, and you can download it from our website right now.
We had a lot of grid events this. Let me phrase that differently. We had a lot of pricing events over the summer of 23, particularly like you said, it's a solar ramp down, and we're going to see significantly like 20 gigs more of solar at this time next year. We also noticed, though, a lot of times the miners were already offline because they're offline avoiding those 4CP charges, which are significant. Do you see anything that makes 24 look better than 23 as far as a better alignment between that solar ramp down and the Bitcoin miners? Or are we looking at a repeat in 24 of what we saw before?
Well, so I think we're used to thinking of the dispatch curve on the generation side and so if we look at it on the load side, that if the break even is $120 a megawatt, then in a sense, the Bitcoin miners are being dispatched at a very low part of the curve in a sense, and that what we saw with this past summer is there might be a battery that is discharging at $5,000 a megawatt, whereas the Bitcoin miner had turned off 2 hours before at $200 a megawatt. And so in a way, yeah, you're right, they're already off. Perhaps, that's an argument to have more Bitcoin mining be in Texas so that you'd be able to avoid those pricing events by taking off more load earlier on. And Riot is developing more Bitcoin mining in Texas. So I think that there's a lot of room for growth, and that there isn't really, if we think about a market saturation argument, I think we're very far from that. I think that there's room for a lot more flexible load in the market, as we saw this past summer. And that arguably that might be competing with batteries and other kind of demand response programs, or not competing, but symbiotic with.
But this is Texas. We don't mind a little competition. That's a good thing, and we'd like to see those prices come down from that $5,000 level. No doubt about that. Anybody else have any comments on that one?
I mean, everybody can bid into SCED at their own pricing, right? So it's not like every miner is dispatched at the same time. Everybody's economics are slightly different, but in general, it's a free market, so I can be dispatched whenever I choose what price point makes sense for me. Same for batteries, same for any other load consumer or dispatcher. So that the reality is ERCOT's done a good job making the playbook to be equally aligned. So you're also getting miners that are much more, they learned a lot. They, if you're mining at $5,000 a megawatt hour, you'll quickly learn how not to do that. So I think as people get smarter on how to mine more profitably within ERCOT, next year you should see, there's still probably going to be a host of issues, but you'll see even more responsiveness from the miners.
And I'd say that there's a broader policy question that there's just not enough generation being built in Texas. And part of that is the economics, right? Texas being deregulated, at the end of the day, what gets built is going to be driven by economics. If we look at the past several years, there's been a lot of incentives to build wind and solar, often in the form of federal tax credits. And so if that continues, then what we're discussing is going to grow as a problem, that these intermittent sources of generation are going to continue to create pricing events when there's not enough wind and the sun is setting. And I think ERCOT recognizes that. They put out that RFP for 3,000 megawatts for the winter. And the legislature recognizes that they've created with the PUC a loan program for the development of more dispatchable thermal generation. And so, as you were saying, a lot of these issues aren't really specific to Bitcoin miners. We play a role in helping solve problems, but quite often these problems are bigger than our own industry, and they're really about kind of the wider energy industry.
And one of the best things for Bitcoin miners, in my opinion, right now is the hydrogen that's coming. And, the governor is 100% behind Texas continuing its leadership role in energy, and hydrogen is, my understanding, is going to have many of the same issues that the Bitcoin miners have. It positives and negatives on both sides, right?
I asked a hydrogen developer what is the break even for electrolysis, or their industrial process, and he didn't give me a clear answer, which gave me pause of how flexible are they if they don't have quite a clear picture of where their break even is. But I think that you're right that it's lower than a traditional manufacturer, and so that they might be in between Bitcoin miner and steel mill.
I think one difference with the hydrogen's electrolysis also like tens of megawatts, 20, 30 megawatts load, but they are not made up of small computer servers at a time. So there's one that are essentially a big electronics, big boxes of electrolyzers. One single unit could be 1 megawatt or higher. So it's electronically it's a different kind of a makeup to study the right through for that, and then ramp up a rate and ramp down rate for those things.
And then I think our last topic is low frequency ride through. And so unlike the Eastern Interconnect, ERCOT is about a third of the size of the Eastern Interconnect. And our frequency does bounce around more so than, frequency is really tied to how big the grid is that you're connected to. And as the grid is smaller, it moves more. That's why Texas is the only state with its own electric grid. because it was the only state physically large enough with enough diversity to be able to pull that off. But that means our frequency bounces around. We have had some low frequency events, and we're worried about more. Any thoughts on how the miners will respond to that?
Yeah, for us, depending on which ancillary services, you might already be compelled to participate in primary frequency response or fast frequency response or whatever program requires, the pay-to-play entry fee. The miners are becoming much better at responding to, stopping a ripple effect of a frequency issue. There's companies like Lancium that do a good job of that, and large miners are already having to participate in a PFR dispatch multiple times a day so that we can get access to some of these other ancillary services. So I think miners are well equipped to handle that because frequency dips vary in both time and amplitude. So I think the large miners specifically are already well suited to kind of handle and help stop the propagation of a frequency event. That's kind of already in our makeup.
All right, we have about 7 minutes left, and I'd like to kind of get some questions from the audience, if y'all have any.
In a way, my question is for you more than the miners. And from ERCOT's perspective, what are the greatest challenges with integrating Bitcoin miners as flexible loads into the grid, especially forecasting that there will be more load from Bitcoin miners and larger, more hyperscale facilities?
So I think the biggest problem that ERCOT's having now is where is it going, right? Which one is real? The transmission planners are fully booked up. They, 38 gigs of large load, regardless of what it is, and that does not include hydrogen. So that 38 gigs does not include the hydrogen because it goes through a different process. There's a large load interconnect process, which in theory is 24 months, less than 24 months. And then there's the RPG, Regional Planning Group process, that's longer than that. If I were a Bitcoin miner, I'd forget the fast load process. It's not any faster. It was a great thought. We thought, we hoped that when we started this, we could do it. Takes too long to get the studies done to really do that. So where is it going? How much is it going? And really, how is it going to behave? Is it going to ride through these things, or is it going to crash the grid? And it's because the grid is different than what we had before.
I was going to add an answer to that question, which is that I think another challenge from a grid operator perspective is, are these facilities going to stick around, right? Because on some level, if you think that, hey, look, Bitcoin's going to zero, all of these players are going to go away, and so we don't want to build up, whether it's physical infrastructure that's going to become a stranded asset or kind of regulatory infrastructure that is going to end up not being used. And so I think that grid operators have to get to a point where, from their perspective, this isn't going away. This is going to continue to grow, and that Bitcoin is something of real value to society. And so we're going to continue to see kind of the expansion of Bitcoin mining businesses as Bitcoin's exchange rate continues to appreciate. But that, I think, is a really challenging perspective to have when you're working in a grid operator looking at long-term planning of, well, now I'm kind of making a speculative bet that, hey, we're long Bitcoin, which isn't necessarily what a grid operator wants to be doing.
In the past, the CREZ lines that were built to connect all the renewables to demand centers, we know that they didn't quite reach the triangle that's expanding, the population and economic triangle. And then there's the land use issues. And I know that with Bitcoin mining, it behooves itself to be in rural areas. And so how are you viewing this mismatch between transmission for renewables, where the load is, demand centers, population centers growing, and then the Gulf Coast, where you have all of the oil and gas and energy transition things happening, and the IRAs, kind of pouring kerosene on a lot of that. So how are you viewing all that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The word prudency comes to mind here. So part of the problem we've had, forever we had problems getting power down to the Brownsville area, down in the valley. Because frankly, in the summertime, everything was fine. And then the snowbirds would go down in the winter. They had resistance heating, load would spike, and we had issues down there. And that existed for 20 years. Well, this last summer, with all the renewables we had down there, that flipped. The good news is the commission has approved 3 new transmission lines going down to South Texas. But really the problem comes in that you don't want to be out spending the public's money to build a line that you don't know if it's going to be used or not, right? Historically, new loads coming on the grid, they took, I think Freeport LNG was 7 years. We had plenty of time to plan for that. New stuff, it looks like we are always going to play catch up until we have a different set of rules. Anybody got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that, from Riot's perspective of our strategy of kind of industrial scale mining, we look for existing transmission that has capacity. So, for example, in Rockdale, the transmission asset, the Sandow switch, it used to be a coal-fired power plant, and it used to be an aluminum manufacturing facility. But when those businesses went away, then you had this switch that was essentially idle, right? And so I think that in some cases, it's not about building more transmission for Bitcoin miners. It's about the flexibility that Bitcoin miners have is not just in their electricity consumption, but it's also in their geography and the location they can have. And so I think that whether it's stranded assets on the grid or off-grid stranded gas assets, that we've seen lots of development for Bitcoin mining on that.
What happens to the behavior of Bitcoin miners if the price of Bitcoin goes way up? Like, let's say the price of Bitcoin goes to $200,000. What does that mean for Bitcoin miners' participation in demand response programs? And what does that mean for the price of ancillary services in Texas?
I think that the first order effect is that you see the break-even increase, right? I mentioned $120 a megawatt. If the Bitcoin price doubles overnight, it's $240 a megawatt, right? And so now, granted, when we look at pricing events, you're still far lower than $5,000 of the regulatory max. But in any case, that does shift all the ancillary services bids to be higher. And that can mean that Bitcoin miners are no longer competitive in ancillary services market, and that would drive up the cost of ancillary services, for the system. But then if we look at longer term, you would have more Bitcoin miners come online. You would have the network difficulty increase, and then the break-even would go back to kind of mean revert back to where it was. And so I think that it would have a short-term effect, but long-term it would go back to the status quo. The big question is, how long are we talking? Because as we see this energy transition happen and the development of AI data centers, there's a lot of demand for infrastructure, for transformers, for electrical equipment, where the long term might not be 2 years, it might be 5 years or 10 years to kind of be able to match between the Bitcoin price and the price of electricity. So we'll see.
Hey guys, thanks for coming out to the 2023 North American Blockchain Summit. It was the best summit yet. We look forward to hosting you again next year. If you enjoyed the summit or like what you saw in this video, be sure to subscribe. If you're interested in learning more about membership in the TBC, go to texasblockchaincouncil.org to learn more.